Now, last week, we started looking at Micah 6 through 8 as kind of a lens, a jumping off point for the message of all of the prophets. And in Micah, we saw kind of a bird's eye view of what God wanted to say to his people. In the midst of a lot of historical change and geopolitical conflict, God called his people to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with their God. Now this week, we want to start taking out each of those little points and looking at it more carefully. What we see from Amos is that justice is a non-negotiable requirement for the people of God. Now, the challenge is, what do we mean by justice? Especially in a context where that word, justice, has become incredibly contested. There are serious and important scholarly debates about justice. But those debates have taken on increased intensity within our nation's political polarization. For some people, justice has become a red flag representing everything that they hate about their political opponents. Literally, there have been pastors hounded out of their churches because their people did not want to hear anything about justice. They assumed that any message about justice was code for something else, a political agenda with which they disagreed. That's really unfortunate because justice is a prevalent, prominent term in the Old Testament. Mishpat is the Hebrew word. But we do need to be clear about what we're talking about, because just as some people have rejected the notion of justice, others have sought to use the notion of justice for their own ends. The best way to prevent us from doing that is to understand what we're talking about. Now, our first insight into the meaning of justice actually comes from right here in Amos chapter 5. It's right there in verse 24. Now, if you're using a modern translation, something other than the King James Version, what you will see is that this material is put into poetic verse. Now, in Hebrew, poetry is not primarily about the rhyming of sounds. It's about the rhyming of ideas. Okay? We call it parallelism. Now, sometimes that parallelism is what we call synonymous parallelism. It's two ways of saying the same thing. So look there at verse 24. Let justice roll on like a river. Righteousness like a never-ending stream. It's the same idea. River, never-ending stream. It's two ways of saying the same thing. We're not talking about a tiny little creek that dries up 6 months out of every year. The prophet has in mind ideas, justice and righteousness, that flow through our lives at all times, that are always present, that are always active. That's synonymous parallelism, okay? Now, sometimes you'll get what scholars call antithetical parallelism. So we will use two ideas that are opposite. But then sometimes the parallelism is not exactly either synonymous or antithetical. Sometimes it's you're relating two ideas, but the relationship is maybe not the easiest to tease out. That's what we have here between justice and righteousness, okay? These two terms. Now, the back half of each line there in verse 24, the back half is synonymous parallelism. But with justice and righteousness, those two things are not the same thing, but they are mirror images of one another. Indeed, what you could say is that justice is righteousness lived in public. Not that righteousness doesn't have influence on your public life, but justice, that word mishpat, narrows our focus to our public life, to our dealings with other people. So, okay, if justice is the mirror image of righteousness, what is righteousness? It's a good question. Righteousness, especially in the Old Testament, this isn't so much true in the New Testament, but in the Old Testament, righteousness is not moral perfection. Some people will teach it as if it is, but it isn't. That's not what the Hebrew term means. But it does connotate a basic orientation towards innocence, towards doing the right thing, towards honesty and integrity. In fact, the New Century Version here translates this word, righteousness, the Hebrew is tzedakah, translates it as goodness. And they mean moral goodness, right? Okay? Not like the goodness of chocolate cake or bacon or barbecue, but moral goodness. That's not far off from what this word, righteousness, is trying to communicate. So I want you to think, as we move forward, well, okay, then what does that mean? What does it mean to live out my righteousness in public? To do my righteousness in a way that affects other people. Okay? That's what we're talking about here. So that's one piece of insight. Another way that the Old Testament gives us insight is by telling stories. And for this, we want to look to the historical literature of the Old Testament. Now, I've put a couple of different stories, summaries of them, up here on the screen for you. Now, the word mishpat, as I recall, is not used in either 2 Samuel 11 through 12 or in 1 Kings 21. Nevertheless, these stories are about justice, or in this case, injustice. The writer of these books, and 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, are really intended to be one big story, okay? The writer of these books intends us to read these stories as not only turning points in Israel's own history, but as examples, in this case, of what not to do. Okay? So what have we got here? We've got this story of David and Bathsheba, and we've got the story of Naboth's vineyard. And if you know those stories, you might be kind of thinking, well, are those really that similar? Well, yeah, actually they are. Because in each case, I should say, you have a king who sees something that he wants. And then he takes what he wants. And then he engineers the death of the person who owns it. Then he's confronted by his sin and repents. It's a very similar story architecture. And what's so interesting about these stories is that one of these kings is the paradigm of devotion to God. The other one is a paradigm of how not to be a king in God's sight. A paradigm of evil and unfaithfulness. And yet, they both commit these horrendous acts that result in the death of innocent subjects. Now, but how do we know that these stories have to do with justice? Well, that's a good question, especially since I've already told you that the word justice is not used in here anywhere. Right? So how do we know? How do we know these stories are about justice? Well, let's take the second story first. That one's easy. Jezebel, King Ahab's wife, used the judicial system to have Naboth put to death. That's about justice. But the first story, David and Bathsheba, that one's about justice too. How do we know? Well, for one thing, the very next story in 2 Samuel is about an egregious miscarriage of justice. David's oldest son, Amnon, violently rapes David's daughter, Tamar. And nothing is done about it. In ancient Israel, that's 2 death penalty offenses, by the way. Rape plus incest. Nothing is done. David's mad about it, but nothing is done. And the second way that we know that this is about justice is because that event becomes the seed out of which a rebellion grows. A rebellion led by Tamar's brother, Absalom, one of David's other sons. And how did Absalom win the support of the people? Well, he sat outside the gate of the city and he started whining about how there's no one to give justice to the people. And he says, if I were king, your case would be legitimate, and your case would be legitimate, and your case would be legitimate, and your case would be legitimate. Absalom was like Oprah Winfrey giving away books, you know. Except he's sitting here claiming you all have legitimate cases, right? It's justice. It's a judicial issue. So these stories are about justice, or in this case, injustice. So with these ideas in mind, how do we define justice and injustice? How do we make sense of all of this? How do we make it applicable to our own lives and our own situation? Well, there's one common element to those stories that I think is really important, and it's the use of power. In the Old Testament, injustice happens when we use our physical, political, economic, social power to benefit ourselves at someone else's expense. So, yeah, if I sneak out to Bobby's one night and steal one of his cows, that's injustice. But if I defraud Bobby on a bank loan so that I can steal all of his cows, that's also injustice. Because what I'm doing is I'm using the abilities that I have to benefit myself at Bobby's expense. Right? Likewise, justice is the use of power to benefit others, especially those who cannot protect themselves and who cannot preserve their own welfare. The poor, the politically vulnerable. That's why we admire people who do police work well. Because they go out and protect people who can't protect themselves. It's why we should admire people who do, child protection work well. Same thing. They're out protecting children who can't protect themselves. It's why we have this whole child welfare system, even as messed up as it is. It's why we have it, because we as a society, under the influence of Scripture, have decided that it is our responsibility to protect people who cannot protect themselves. That's justice in the Old Testament. Now, it's not always governmental. In fact, that's kind of the point, is that justice is something we all must do. So what are the arenas in which justice must take place? What are the arenas that injustice was taking place in ancient Israel? Well, Amos answers that question for us. Now, this is not an exhaustive list, okay? It is suggestive. But it's a list that I think will help us as we think through how this understanding of justice must impact our own lives. Obviously, justice or injustice is active in the sphere of the judicial, right? So let me tell you what would happen in ancient Israel. Amos makes repeated references to this. One way that you could defraud somebody in court is to bring false charges. Another way is to bring false witnesses. Or you could bribe the judge to issue a false fine. Right? That's a lot. There's lots of ways to manipulate the judicial system to hurt other people. So also with the legislative or administrative system, it's not like they had an actual legislature, but how were laws made? How were policies set? Well, again, we have references to this in Amos. He's talking about this straw tax there in Amos chapter 5. Let me tell you something. If you're taxing straw, who are you taxing? You're taxing the absolutely most vulnerable people. And it's not like you're taxing them because you need that money. You're taxing it to give it to wealthier people, right? That's what's happening here. But other ways also, other areas of policy led to oppression. And without belaboring the point, let's just put it this way. Economic conditions were changing, and people were losing their farms. People were being squeezed out of their holdings because it was more efficient to have these larger agricultural units, right? It was a change that was destined to happen. But at the same time, whenever there is change like this, lots of people get hurt. And these people who used to have small holdings, remember, this is an agricultural society, now they don't have that holding. What are they supposed to do for work? How are they supposed to feed themselves and their family? Well, they end up as day laborers for the people who now own the land they used to own. Now they become dependent upon those wealthy elites. But this all comes from the king, because the king wants as much money as he can get in tax revenue. Another arena, well, we've just been kind of talking about it, is the economic arena. Now, here's how the scam would go. So let's say Roy's a merchant over here, and Paolo comes to him and sells him some grain, right? Well, Roy uses one set of weights to measure Paolo's grain so that he can pay him less for the grain. Paolo actually brought him, let's say 100 pounds, but it weighs out to be only 85. But then, when Natalia comes to buy that same grain, Roy switches the weights. And now that same 100 pounds, which he told Paolo was only 85, he tells Natalia is 115. He's making money coming and going, right? That's how the scam worked. That's what people were doing. Now, another way that injustice happened in these economic contexts is through predatory lending. We know about that, don't we? At times we've heard people talking about sort of the predatory lending practices of paycheck lenders and that kind of thing. Well, they had the same kinds of problems. People would use debt as a way to steal people's land. Right? Now, these different political arenas and the economic arena, that may seem obvious to you as an area, as an arena of injustice. But there's a fourth one there. And I almost didn't put it in. But Amos chapter 2, verse 7 makes a passing reference to it, and you can't tell the David story without it. One of the areas where injustice was the most prevalent in the ancient world was in the area of sexuality. And unfortunately, the same is true today. What I think a lot of people don't realize is that most women who are in prostitution are there either because they were kidnapped and forced into prostitution, or because they have a drug habit that has pushed them into prostitution. And even then, what ends up happening is they end up, either way, under the thumb of someone else. They are essentially slave labor for somebody else. But here's something that's even more frightening. A lot of times the pornography industry works the same way. There are women who participate in the pornography industry by their own choice and make lots of money in it, so on and so forth. But there are a lot of women whose bodies are displayed for the entire world to see on the internet, who did not do so by choice. And they are being exploited for someone else's gain. Those are just a couple of small ways in which injustice worms its way into this most delicate, this most intimate aspect of human life. And unfortunately, it is ubiquitous in history. Now, I've given you a lot of information this morning. You may feel like you're drinking out of a fire hose. So how do we sort of draw this all together and make it simple and applicable to our lives? Well, the prophet Amos presents us with a choice. We can either be a wolf or a sheepdog. Whether we like it or not, we all have power of one sort or another. It may not be very much, but we all have it. If you don't think everybody has power, we have some friends in Arlington who have basically newborn triplets. We'll let you spend the night with them, and you'll find out very quickly. Those itty-bitty babies have lots of power because everybody be jumping up out of bed to take care of them when they squall at 2 o'clock in the morning. If Roy squalls at 2 o'clock in the morning, ain't none of us doing nothing, right? But a baby does. So we all, if a baby does, we all jump up. Everyone has power of one sort or another. The question is, how do we use it? Do we use it to prey upon people? Or do we use it to protect people? Do we use it to destroy people? Or do we use it to lead people to life? It's that simple. Will we be a wolf? Or will we be a sheepdog? God is calling us to be sheepdogs. And that's what I hope all of us will commit ourselves to be. Let's pray.